Pick up a sword. Feel the weight of it, the length of it, the specific geometry of a blade designed to be held in one hand while reaching the body of someone who is trying to kill you from a distance that a knife cannot cover and a spear makes awkward. The sword is not an obvious invention. It did not appear suddenly in the mind of a single genius. It arrived slowly through thousands of years of accumulated violence, metallurgical discovery, and the ruthless logic of what keeps you alive in a fight. The story of how humans invented the sword is really the story of how humans learned to work metal, and that story is stranger, longer, and more contingent than most people realize. Start before metal. Before there were swords, there were long knives, and before long knives, there were daggers, and before daggers, there were sharp stones. The logic of edged weapons has a continuous history that runs from the first deliberately knapped flint, roughly 2.5 million years ago, to the steel-bladed weapons that defined warfare for most of recorded history. The sword did not replace a gap. It extended a tradition. The key transition happened when humans learned to work copper. Copper is the first metal that humans smelted deliberately, beginning around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in the ancient Near East, the Balkans, and independently in other regions. Copper is soft by the standards of what came later, but it has properties that stone does not. It can be cast into shapes. It can be hammered and annealed, heated and worked without shattering, and critically, it can be made longer than a stone blade without becoming structurally unsound. A stone blade longer than about 30 centimeters becomes mechanically problematic. Stone has no tensile strength. It resists compression but fails under bending forces. A long stone blade is a blade waiting to snap, but a copper blade can be made longer, and a longer blade reaches further. In combat, reach is survival. The earliest objects that we might genuinely call swords, as distinct from long daggers, begin appearing in the archaeological record around 1700 BCE in the Aegean world. These are bronze weapons, because by this point, the crucial discovery had already been made. Copper alloyed with tin produces bronze, a material significantly harder, stronger, and more durable than either metal alone. The Bronze Age swords of the Aegean, weapons like the Type A and Type B swords found at sites across Greece and the wider Mediterranean, are the first weapons in the archaeological record that were clearly designed to cut as well as thrust, with a blade geometry optimized for both functions simultaneously. This matters enormously. A knife or a dagger is primarily a thrusting weapon. You drive the point into something. A sword designed to cut, to slash, to deliver wounds along the length of the blade rather than just the tip is a qualitatively different weapon. It requires a different fighting style, it requires different training, and it requires a different level of metallurgical sophistication to produce, because a blade designed to slash must be rigid along its length and sharp along its edge simultaneously, which requires precise control of the alloy composition and the heat treatment. Ancient smiths achieved this not through written chemistry, but through accumulated craft knowledge. They knew, through generations of trial and experience, which proportions of copper and tin produced a workable casting. They knew how to control the heat of the fire. They knew how to hammer the cooled blade to harden the edge without cracking it. This knowledge was professional knowledge, specialist knowledge, knowledge that was kept and transmitted within communities of smiths, who were among the most valued and sometimes most feared members of ancient societies. The smith was not simply a craftsperson. The smith was a transformer. Someone who took one kind of thing, rock and ore, and produced another, shining metal. In many ancient cultures, smithing was surrounded by ritual, secrecy, and mythological significance. The forge was a liminal space where matter was changed. Hephaestus in Greek myth, Wayland Smith in Norse and Anglo-Saxon tradition, Goibniu in Irish mythology. The divine smith appears across cultures as a figure of profound and somewhat unsettling power. The weapon he produces partakes of that power, but the sword that defined the ancient world was not the bronze sword of the Aegean. It was the iron sword that began replacing bronze around 1200 BCE, during the period historians call the Bronze Age collapse, when the palace economies of the eastern Mediterranean disintegrated and the trade networks that supplied tin for bronze making were disrupted. Iron ore is far more widely available than the specific combination of copper and tin deposits needed for bronze. A society that could not access bronze could potentially access iron, and iron properly worked, produces a blade that is harder and tougher than bronze. But iron is more difficult to work than bronze. Bronze can be cast into a mold and then finished. Early iron, which is what smiths had before the invention of steel, must be worked differently. It must be heated to very high temperatures and hammered repeatedly, folded and worked to drive out impurities and produce a workable blade. The early iron swords of the transition period, roughly 1200 to 900 BCE, were often actually inferior to good bronze swords in terms of edge retention and structural integrity. Iron won not because it was immediately better, but because it was available when bronze was not. The real leap came with the discovery of steel. Steel is iron with a controlled carbon content, and the difference between iron and steel is the difference between a mediocre sword and an excellent one. Carbon, introduced through the smelting process or through deliberate carburization, fills the spaces in the iron crystal structure and dramatically increases hardness and edge retention. The discovery that iron could be transformed into steel through specific heating and cooling processes that ancient smiths discovered empirically without knowing the chemistry involved, was one of the most consequential technological discoveries in human history. By the time of the Roman gladius, the short stabbing sword that was the primary weapon of the Roman legionary, or the Greek kopis, or the Celtic longsword that Roman soldiers encountered with alarm in the field, the sword had become a mature technology. It had a design language. It had a set of established forms, each optimized for specific fighting styles and contexts. It had an industrial production system, with Roman legions supplied by organized weapons production facilities that could outfit tens of thousands of soldiers with standardized equipment. The gladius itself is a masterpiece of functional design, short enough to be used in the tight formations of Roman infantry combat, long enough to reach past a shield, double-edged, capable of cutting in both directions, weighted and balanced for precise thrusting into gaps in enemy armor. Every dimension of the gladius reflects thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about what works in the specific context of ancient infantry warfare. And then came the longsword. As armor improved, as the thickness and sophistication of metal armor increased through the medieval period, the sword evolved again, longer reach to threaten armored opponents, more complex cross-sections that combined rigidity in the blade with sharp edges, more sophisticated hilt designs that protected the hand and allowed more complex techniques. The medieval European longsword, the weapon that has become the iconic image of the sword in the popular imagination, is not a primitive weapon. It is the product of centuries of iterative design, responding to the evolving arms race between offense and defense that ran through the entire medieval period. The sword was never finished. Every generation of smiths refined it, responding to the weapons and armor of their opponents, the fighting styles of their own warriors, the materials available in their region, and the manufacturing techniques their craft communities had developed. This is what the sword really is. Not a single invention, but an ongoing conversation between the humans who made weapons and the humans who faced them. A negotiation conducted in metal and blood over thousands of years, producing one of the most refined and sophisticated hand tools in human history. Pick up a sword. You are holding the end point of a conversation that began with a piece of flint and a human hand 2.5 million years ago.